Right. Good evening, everybody, and good you're here in such numbers for Amos or whatever. We come to the fourth session this evening, and we're looking at a theme: God does Exodus in the plural. Now, in her historical novel, Alison Pataki has Habsburg Emperor Franz Joseph say to Bavarian Princess Elizabeth, "I rule by divine right. If they love God, then they love me. But to rule, a king needs respect." Well, the emperor in the novel and in real life was supposed to marry Elizabeth's sister Helene, but he fell in love with the younger Elizabeth, sometimes known or often known as Sisi, married her instead, and a very relieved Helene, it must be said, returned to Bavaria. Now, though historical fiction in Pataki's book, the emperor in real life did believe that he ruled by divine right, and a lot of kings and monarchs did. The Habsburg dynasty lasted for nearly a millennium, from the 10th century, and perhaps it was unsurprising that Franz Joseph believed that he ruled by divine right. Whatever about a king needing respect, the belief in absolute authority led, as it can do, to an exercise of absolute authority. And on New Year's Day, or New Year's Eve, 1851, Franz Joseph issued instructions known as the Sylvester Plant, which abolished the Constitution and gave himself the sole right to make laws. He would not only be emperor, but act as prime minister. And for the next 10 years, he exercised what Martin Radi, the latest historian of the Habsburg Empire, has described as neo-absolutism or neo-Caesarism, when Franz Joseph ruled as a dictator. Now, in the early 17th century, King James I, of the King James Bible renown, also claimed the divine right of a king, putting himself above the law and expecting to be unquestioned. On some British coins that we carry in our pockets, there are the letters DG, Latin for by divine appointment. The motto on a British Honours Award, one of them at least, is for God and Empire. And Kaiser Wilhelm II had for God and Fatherland, including on World War I soldiers' belts and uniform buttons. But how did these people and their establishments know this? Did God tell them this? Or did they invent it and make it up? Another version of this is exceptionalism, claimed by superpowers and empires. Theologically, it is chosenness. The theme appears in the Bible: chosen people or God's elect, a particular historical community chosen or elected by God for a special status and destiny in the world. Theologically, in the Hebrew Bible and Christian Testament, it is a claim made for the Jewish people, though Christian supersessionism has claimed this chosenness or election exclusively for itself, superseding the Jews as God's people. Now, the 20th century, I think, has exposed this claim for the heresy it is and its contribution to anti-Semitism. It is, though, a claim at the heart of Western Euro, British and American culture and history, and exceptionalism was core to European hegemony and British imperialism and the current nostalgia. It is essential to American self-understanding, the secular version being manifest destiny, but underpinned by a recast biblical chosenness ever since Cotton Mather was identified by the first colonial settlers as America's Nehemiah. the governor of the chosen people. US exceptionalism tends to pervade American foreign policy. Obama in 2013 claimed that US policy is what makes, he said, America different. It's what makes us exceptional. Now, this was critiqued by no less than Vladimir Putin, who said, and I quote, "It is extremely dangerous to encourage people to see themselves as exceptional, whatever the motivation. We are all different, but when we ask for the Lord's blessing, we must not forget that God created us equal." Well, maybe Vladimir Putin was Amos's boy, but he sounds rather like Amos and was right that exceptionalism is extremely dangerous, easily leading to self-importance, self-righteousness, and throwing off all restraint in the exercise of power. In its Western, Euro, British, and American expressions, it is very often essentially white supremacist. Britain and America showed not a little exceptionalism in relation to COVID-19. As a theologically based political and imperial practice, in Brueggemann's words, appeal to exceptionalism as God's chosen people can cover a multitude of sins, for example, economic injustice and political oligarchy, all in the name of chosenness. So Amos was an early critic of this, and he voiced God's judgment on all forms of divine right and chosenness and exceptionalism. Well, that was short. I'm going to stop there because maybe we could go into rooms, Loretto, and there is a question. It will come up on your chat line. The divine right to rule, exceptionalism in Western, Euro, British, and American culture and history. Is it all made up and nothing to do with God? See what we make of that for 15 minutes. Okay, I take it we're back. Let's move on and look at exceptionalism as not exceptional. We have been looking, and we have mentioned in an earlier session, the book of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy's development, as we noted, was running in parallel to the development of the book of Amos. And on any reading of Deuteronomy, we're drawn into a belief in one God with one people, worshipping the one God in one place. Now, we will explore the tensions between royal theology and prophetic theology in one of our later sessions. But in Deuteronomy and what we call the Deuteronomistic history, that is the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings, there is a strong mono theme. Singular claims are made for Yahweh and for Israel. And the problem was that the Yahweh alone claim became sometimes Israel alone. And that became the theology of monarchy and the divine right to rule. And royal theology became civil religion, which was opposed by Amos. Now, we're dealing here with what Walter Brueggemann has described as a problematic and seductive assertion. It has been seductive to ancient Israel and to many powers since. Again, it's been said, Brueggemann and Stroop in their book, the assertion enabled Israel to imagine itself as privileged in every sphere of life, as Yahweh's unrivaled and inalienable partner. Now, there's no avoiding particularity in the biblical tradition. God chooses or elects a people. At the same time, there is no avoiding universality in the biblical tradition. There is a God who chose the Jewish people and the universal God, or God of universal concern. And both particularity and universality are held and are to be held somehow together. In the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, conceptions of chosenness or election had, it seems, been construed as a matter of privilege. Bruce Birch puts it this way: exclusive possession of God or moral superiority among the nations. The prophets, though, point towards a new inclusiveness that does not receive fullest expression until the time of the exile and restoration. And the book of Amos, as we've noted before, reaches its final form in that era of Babylonian exile and restoration. And it was second Isaiah, the chapters 40 to 55, coming out of Babylon, which gave articulation to real purpose of chosenness or election. It was not, nor was it ever, for privilege, but for responsibility. The second Isaiah put it this way: I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. It's part of the servant song from that prophet. And the servant songs, a number of them, from that same prophet, are not always clear as to the identity of the servant, but there is a strong case for the servant being Israel, again underlining responsibility rather than privilege. And the responsible role is to bring justice to the world and to do so non-violently. The late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks put it well. In Judaism, he said, revelation is political because the Jewish project is not to scale the heavens in search of God, but to bring the divine presence down to earth in the structures of our social life. In other words, the Jewish destiny or service to the world is to create a society of justice, generosity, and peace. And Sacks was also clear about the nature of monotheism or God's oneness. He said the truth at the beating heart of monotheism is that God transcends the particularities of culture and the limits of human understanding. He is my God, but also the God of all humankind, even of those whose customs and way of life are unlike mine. Well, monotheism does not lead to mono, but to many and diversity. And the particular is within the universal. And for Amos, this meant that exceptionalism was not exceptional. After a litany of neighboring peoples' crimes against humanity and announcing God's judgment on such inhumane crimes, Amos makes no exception for the chosen people. After affirming that God had brought the people out of the land of Egypt, the great Exodus liberation, there follows a shocking assertion to exceptional people. Amos 3, verses 1 and 2, for you only have I known of all the families of the earth, therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities. The verb to know or known indicates a very intimate relationship. In Hebrew, the deep loving sexual relationship. Yahweh has known this particular people as no other people. The Deuteronomists affirmed that relationship also. But then Amos drops the big bombshell. The Hebrew for iniquities is a one, which in Donald Gowan's words seems to be the darkest of the sin words in Hebrew, including in its meaning the act, the resulting guilt, and the punishment. As far as Amos is concerned, society is rife with injustices, especially economic injustices of a wealthy, powerful elite, a chasm between rich and poor, gross inequalities, and structural, judicial, and economic injustice. There is no society of economic justice, generosity, and peace The covenantal social relationships are broken. The responsibility for which the people have been chosen has been ignored. And no matter the strength of exceptionalism, in the end, they are not exceptional when their society lacks ethics and social justice. Because they are or think of themselves exceptional, the elect, the judgment in history is strong. Brueggemann and Stroop again. Thus Amos must struggle with an ethical monotheistic Yahwehism that has been drawn too tightly into self-confidence and that has issued in a distorting self-sufficiency. In the end, exceptionalism can count for nothing. And finally, God does Exodus in the plural. Amos really pushes the boundaries in chapter 9, verse 7. Brueggemann's words, in the historical context, the political economic leadership of northern Israel had assumed that its chosenness gave the powerful warrant for exploitative practices and policies of extraction from the vulnerable. Amos in chapter 3, verse 2, has acknowledged the particular status and has punctured the moral superiority to everyone else and the sense of privilege. And then the remarkable rhetoric of chapter 9, verse 7. Are you not like the Ethiopians to me, O people of Israel, says the Lord? Did I not bring Israel up from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir? And Amos names two immediate and traditional enemies, the Philistines and the Arameans or the Syrians. And using familiar Exodus language, Amos applies it to these traditional enemies. Of course, God has liberated Israel from Egypt. That is what they thought made them exceptional. But God has also liberated Israel's traditional enemies. God is historically engaged and involved with other peoples. God does not do Exodus singular, but Exodus in the plural. God's liberating presence and power is universal. Israel's claim of exceptionalism has been de-absolutized. Walter Brueggemann, Israel has no monopoly on Yahweh's saving deeds, and therefore cannot claim privilege or imagine itself exceptional. Rather, Israel stands exposed, like every other people, to the demands of this God. Now, no one in the 8th century or the 6th century BCE Israel or Judah expected this. In Amos 3, verse 2, the prophet has highlighted Israel's chosenness as the basis of divine judgment. And in 9:7, he compounds the problem. Israel is not so distinctly and impressively chosen if the others are chosen as well. Isaiah 19, verses 24 to 25 is more radical still. The Assyrians and the Egyptians named in the Isaiah text are not just near neighbors. They are the big empires which dominated Israel and whose emperors and leaders believed that they were in the image of God, that they too, the prophet is saying, they too, these peoples, are chosen peoples. God has not one chosen people, but many. God does Exodus in the plural. The prophets are universalists without ever denying particularity. But they know that exceptionalism can and often does lead to divine and moral judgment as leaders and people get carried away with moral superiority, privilege, status, self-sufficiency, and create elite societies where socio-economic justice, neighbourly solidarity, generosity, equality, peace, or the common good are all missing. Empires, political or economic, nations, elites, and indeed religious institutions can and do perish on exceptionalism. There are two questions that we might want to consider in the discussions, and we go to rooms again. How do we hold the particular and the universal together? And there's a sub-question to that. How, and it's a big one in one sense, how does the church avoid supersessionism? And finally, God does Exodus in the plural, and God has many chosen peoples. What does this theology of the prophets mean for how we live in today's world? And does Amos disturb our traditional theological outlook? See what we can make of those in 20 minutes, and then we'll come back.